what I want to do is to, I got to try to rush ahead now because we're starting the fourth session. We're halfway through. We've done 3 sessions, and I'm still in my second session, so I got to push ahead. You got to bear with me. Let's put on the the 7-league boots, you might say. So just on Leibniz summary, you've heard it before. We inhabit a least action universe. Example, why is the Earth a sphere and not a cube? Why are there no cubic planets? Because the sphere encloses the mass most efficiently. The circle gives you the most area within a given distance on the circumference. If you do a square the same length as the circumference of the circle, the outer perimeter of the square encloses less area. So one of the reasons is it's a least action universe. Why do objects roll down the geodetic? The geodetic is the line that you're going to run down and roll down. Why does water have surface tension? It organizes itself. What is the origin of the forms of self-organization of plasma that you can see in these fusion reactors or a plasma focus device or something like this? In other words, there are self-organizing features of the material world that the purely, Newtonian randomness does not explain. And this is what we feel would be a better direction for science, the Leibnizian least action universe. Now, example. We got to fight against entropy in the natural sciences, right? That's what we're showing here with the Darwinian stuff and related. So the universe as a whole has a pro-development bias. Let's look at entropy as preached by the British school. Let's look at the black holes. Well, the Lockeans and the empiricists are constantly confronted in the world of cosmology and astronomy by energy sources they cannot explain. And whenever they run into something that they cannot explain in the way of energy sources, they fall back on the idea of entropy in the extreme form of gravitational collapse. For example, the understanding that the stars, the sun, run on thermonuclear fusion, right? This is a relatively new thing. I think it's von Weizsäcker in the 1930s who comes up with these equations. The British school, for example, around 100 years ago, Sir James Jeans, argued that the energy of the sun was not derived from thermonuclear reactions, but rather from gravity collapse. In other words, the sun was slowly collapsing in on itself, and that's what generated the energy. And if you read the book by Sir James Jeans, he says, the sun seems to be composed of hydrogen, helium, things like this, but it could be composed of bricks, and it would still glow. It would still give off light, because the bricks would be collapsing in. Now today, if you find an energy source that cannot be explained, their tendency is to call it a black hole. And unfortunately, Hawking does this, and this rather chilling fellow that I heard the other night, Professor Penrose of Oxford, is on some kind of a book tour. So he got on Science Friday with Ira Flatow and started talking about black holes and big bangs and the rest of this stuff, which I think is largely a mythology. Now, you want to be interested to know that the black hole was theorized in 1783. It's not new. We have this guy, John Mitchell. Those are his dates. In 1783, he wrote a paper for the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, that international gang that filches discoveries. But in this case, he posited the existence of black holes, which he called dark stars. And you can see it's the same idea. Essentially, the gravity collapse reaches a point where the gravity of this entity, whatever it is so strong that the light cannot escape. The light is pulled back in, so therefore you don't see it, you just see a black hole, because the light can't escape. So if there should ever really exist in nature any bodies whose density is not less than the sun, but more, and whose diameters are more than 500 times the diameter of the sun, their light could not arrive at us. That's a black hole. Now, of course, there are stars that are much bigger than this, right? 500 times. Antares is bigger than that, I think. And we seem to have Laplace of the French school suggesting the same idea in his Exposition du Système du Monde. The wonderful thing about black holes is they can't be observed. So you can't prove that they're there or not. All you can say is, well, certain things are happening and it must be a black hole. But you're not showing that there's a black hole. Now, that's not a picture of a black hole. That's artist's conception. Nobody's ever seen a black hole. By definition, you can't see it. There's no light coming out. So this becomes a wonderful receptacle for all the stuff you can't understand. There are energy phenomena going on that they can't understand. Say, well, it must be a gravity collapse. I showed you the quasar before with that jet coming out. That was supposedly in the infancy, the very early years of the universe, less than 1 billion years of universe, there was already a black hole in the middle of that. Right? And of course, once the black hole is created, nothing ever gets out. If you go in there, you wouldn't survive, but if you go in there, you'll never get out, right? You're permanently segregated into your black hole. So you can see what this creates some tremendous problems. So my contention is that this is, again, the abuse of a entropic, empiricist, reductionist outlook that does not take into account what other things might be going on. And again, 100 years ago, they said the sun is simply collapsing. There's no energy source there. It's just generating heat and light because it's collapsing in so fast, right? And that can go on for a long time. Now, in some ways, back to our friends, the mushheads. Our friends. Maybe some of you have already seen this, but this is now my little game. Who's the most influential philosopher of the past 25 years? So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is my candidate. And I'll try to show you why. It's very striking. If you want to have a guide to the mind of the modern left-liberal mushhead, I'm afraid you have to go back to Rousseau. And if I just can come over here and get a water, I can deal with our friends, the mushheads.
Is Rousseau, is that the noble savage?
That's the noble savage.
Oh.
You've got it exactly right. That's probably the main thing to know. So, he is, along with Howard Zinn is sort of Rousseau in history. But Rousseau is the guy who says, civilization has been a terrible mistake. Let's go back. Civilization corrupts, science corrupts, property, government, all corrupt. Here he is, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So civilization is bad. The current form of civilization is really bad. Better was the Paleolithic. Hunting and gathering. Cavemen. Foraging. So you could say all of history has been a terrible detour, right? A complete mistake. So this is really the most extreme historical cultural pessimism. It's the kind of thing you see in the pages of Howard Zinn. I don't know if Howard Zinn read this, but I think he got it through an indirect feature of, it was another follower of Rousseau. We'll see who that is in a minute. So Rousseau's individual story is this. He was in Venice for a good year and a half, as secretary of the French ambassador. So he learned the contempt for civilization right at the center of this, which is always the Venetians. He's there at the same time as Gianmaria Ortes was in full activity. And later in his life, he spent a couple of years as the house guest of this other guy we've been attacking, the British empiricist David Hume, the guy whose conclusion was that you can't know anything. Now, remember, the dominant positive figure of the 18th century is Benjamin Franklin, world famous because of the kite experiment of 1750. So Rousseau, I think this is about 1755, something like that, a couple of years after the Franklin kite, and in the middle of the enthusiasm for Franklin and electricity and science, Rousseau makes his debut with his Discourse on Sciences and Arts. What's the point? Enlightenment and progress bring corruption and decadence. It's bad. It's better to avoid progress and stay close to the primitive ignorance which we see, as he says, among the Swiss and among American Indians. This is him talking, not me, huh? I didn't say it. Sparta was better than Athens because it was more natural. The sciences are there, sorry for the typos, the sciences are there to satisfy the vice and pride of the scientists. They promote luxury and not natural living, not that clean living in a yurt. Science cannot be relied on. Don't believe science. It's unreliable in its methods and its findings. And there is some question about whether he even did this himself or whether he copied from this other guy, Diderot. Diderot is the great impulse of the French encyclopedia of materialists and atheists and what have you. Okay, so that must have been before 1755, because then he comes back in a year or two and he writes Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, right? Big theme, right? And of course, the left liberal mushhead thinks that we've got to have absolute equality of outcomes. No, again, 20 to 1, 30 to 1, 50 to 1, you can live with all that, but not 600 or 700 to 1, and that's where we are now. So you've got to establish, and above all, the thing is, are people in the bottom part of the scale rising or falling? And do they come up with the necessary wherewithal to prepare their children for the technology on the horizon? Because that's what necessity dictates. Well, inequality is caused by property. So it means the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, from the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age. Primitive man is vigorous and strong, of course. You know, living to 30 or 32, whatever. Cannibalism and infanticide. He is morally healthy because he follows only his instincts. There is no instinctual sublimation, right? Gratification of passions is always the order of the day. And the only thing he's interested in is self-preservation. Well, that's all he can do. That's as high as he can aim. And this wonderful situation we've been robbed by social progress and by moral corruption, and these are the same. This is Rousseau. This is one of the most influential thinkers, I think, in the world today, maybe the most. And there's more. Remember the sovereign individual, the libertarian lunatic fantasy? I guess that's your department. Yeah, well, how did society come along? Well, we had sovereign individuals, right? We started with sovereign individuals, right? Aleut, the caveman, I suppose, was one. And they formed families and clans. Now, the problem with this is you were social before you were human. In other words, the hominids, right? Whatever they are, the primates and hominids and pre-human and early human, Cro-Magnon, whatever you want to call them, those were social. They operated as groups before they became human. So this is absolutely wrong. This posits a situation that never existed. You never had sovereign individuals who were human roaming around alone. It never happened. It couldn't. So the thing about the sovereign individual is a fraud. Some people say, there was a primal horde. Okay, that's better than this. The primal horde of Freud and some others is that before you were human, there was this primal horde of quasi-human, pre-human. These sovereign individuals were economically independent. They were all libertarians. So this is the basis of Robinson Crusoe, right? The Robinson Crusoe novel is somebody who is autarkical and self-sufficient and a sovereign individual. It's an autarky. Now, When did things begin to go wrong? Well, as soon as you have metallurgy and farming and a division of labor, that's when things begin to go wrong, says Rousseau. It's crazy. This is actual progress, right? One of the problems with hunting and gathering, one of the things that made farming and metallurgy attractive is, do you want to keep all the children you have? Do women want to keep babies, or do they want to abandon them and leave them behind to be preyed on? Well, once you've gone beyond 2 kids, that's about as much as you can carry, maybe 3. And after that, you're going to have to leave them behind. So the benefits of farming include you get to keep all your children. Is that worth it? I mean, from a lot of points of view, it is. But not from his. We'll see what was with him. Well, then, once metallurgy and farming got going and the division of labor developed, the rich, evil people came along and imposed discriminatory laws, and they created an authoritarian, oppressive power that only increased social injustice. Now, to return to the point about the babies. He had a mistress. They had 5 children. And what he did with those kids, he took them direct to the foundling home, and he left them there. He had 5 children, and he just dumped them. Sounds kind of cruel, right? Sounds a little bit inhuman. And then we have the social contract. There is this thing where he writes about the theater, that he hates not just French classicism, Corneille, Racine, but he also hates Shakespeare. And you got to remember, the people who did most with drama were the Jesuits. There's a very good body of opinion that Shakespeare was some kind of Jesuit. He was certainly a Catholic, certainly hated Queen Elizabeth of England, very strongly in sympathy with Spain, spent time in Rome, spent time in Italy and Verona, the things that he writes about in his plays. So that's Rousseau, doesn't like that. Anyway, the sovereign individuals at a certain point give up their natural rights to obtain the protection that only a community can afford. This is a complete myth. Again, this is complete paranoid nonsense. And what comes out of this new community is the general will. Now, here we're making the transition from libertarian sovereign individuals to a totalitarian dictatorship, which is sort of what has to happen. And this part reminds us of Hobbes, that you have the war of all against all, right? They're all fighting each other, and the only way you can suppress that is by having a dictator, a Cromwell, someone who can crush all of the competing sovereign individuals. So that the way he reflects it is the general will which will reign supreme. You can call it totalitarian liberalism, which is what we face with this political correctness. Or you can say this is the preparation of the reign of terror, and it is. The general will is the basis of the reign of terror and Robespierre. So he says elective aristocracy is the best form of government, but you need to have a periodic purge by assemblies. And that's the Committee of Public Safety, 1793 to 94. That's the terror. So there's Rousseau from this stuff about science bad, civilization bad, sovereign individuals, social contract, and then totalitarian dictatorship. This is not a good system.
Does he offer any evidence for this?
Huh?
Does he offer any evidence?
Well, no, it's just a it's what happened, his anthropological view, right? What evidence? I mean, I'm sure there's some, right? But it's trivial. It's essentially a fable. It's a fairy tale. Like, what evidence does Howard Zinn have? He fakes, he doesn't have evidence, so he fakes it. Now, the target of all this is Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, embodies this scientific optimism. And he's a great political fighter against the British Empire. He starts off as an industrial worker. He's a printer. He's a worker. He's a blue-collar worker. And people who hate him include Mary Shelley, right? Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, idol of feminists, because this is the new Prometheus, right? He steals electricity from the gods and brings it down to be available for humans, and he's also the founder of the U.S. Postal Service, which we propose to fight to maintain, because without the U.S. Postal Service, there's a death sentence for rural America, and we care about that. the kite experiment, again, is 1750, published in France, repeated in France in 1752, and he was the ambassador to France during the American Revolution, and without him, nothing could have been accomplished. You should compare the Confessions of Rousseau to the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and you'll get an idea of the two outlooks. And they also shared this thing with fur hats. When I started this slide, I was going to try to prove that Rousseau had copied the fur hat off Franklin. I'm not sure. Just the fact that this engraving is earlier than that one. This one is earlier, right? Rousseau claimed that this is an Armenian costume, whereas Franklin comes with a beaver, coonskin cap. Anyway, there they are, the two of them facing off. And as was pointed out, the noble savage. The paragon of wisdom is a human being not corrupted by civilization, the noble savage. A child can also do it, but only if natural and not yet corrupted. So he's got this book, Émile, a manual of education. I don't know if you remember Jean-Luc Godard. Some people do. That's this movie called Le Gai Savoir, the gay science, meaning happy science. There's a movie, which is essentially Émile, done by a French filmmaker today. So this is permissive education, Summerhill, anti-authoritarianism. In other words, the Oedipus complex institutionalized. But the noble savage, this is very widespread, right? That primitive peoples know best, that you should listen to them, right? When you don't know what to do, you should apply to the Yanomami Indians of the interior of Brazil. And I don't know what the basis of that is. Rousseau is influential through Freud. Freud's argument, once again, the sublimation of instinctual gratification is bad. And he writes a whole book, Civilization and Its Discontents. What does it argue? That people, there's political turmoil in the world because there's not enough instinctual gratification and too much sublimation. So civilization will always bring this problem with it. And you have Wilhelm Reich. Erich Fromm. The CIA version is Norman O'Brien, Life Against Death. Herbert Marcuse, the great influential philosopher of 1968. The Frankfurt School, which is a part of the CIA eventually. There they all are. And that's pretty much the 1968, right? For those who have been meeting with Bill Ayers and Bernardine, you asked them, how about Marcuse? Right on, I think, anyway. Or maybe as weathermen, they think it's too much the establishment. So that's Freud. I've written about Freud. I've written about him from the point of view of the Kabbalah. But the main thing about him is that this is Rousseau expressed in psychology. Now remember, Kubi is, in theory, a Freudian, but not really. Because he's taken this concept of the preconscious and he's transformed the entire system starting from that. So he's really not a Freudian. But in the 1950s, if you wanted to make a living, you had to be some kind of a Freudian in order to hang out your shingle, as old Gore Vidal was saying. Now, in economics, it's Marx. Because when you have the noble savage as the source of the salvation of civilization and everything else, for Marx, the noble savage is the guy who's going to overthrow the modern industrial economy. It's the proletarian. And they see the proletariat as the people who have been denied everything. The damned of the earth, right? Les damnés de la terre, the ones who have been totally excluded, immiserated, deprived, and so forth. They can make the revolution. So what you can see is the Marxist asks, what is the negation of modern civilization? Why it's the proletarian? Because he's been stripped and humiliated, and then he's going to bring nemesis, right? He's going to bring the punishment for that. So the negation of civilization then becomes the means of reforming everything. The book here is Rousseau and Marx by Galvano della Volpe, Italian Marxist of 20 or 30 years ago. And Marx, personally, well, the short form on Marx is British agent. Worked in the British Museum Library. How could you do that? Only if British intelligence wanted you to. Engels is even more obviously British in his pedigree. He's a member of something called Young Germany. And the young groups, Young France, Young Italy, Young Germany, Young Poland, Young America. There's Young America. Franklin Pierce, ancestor of Barbara Bush. He was Young America. There's Young America, Minnesota. Anybody ever been there? You drive through. This comes from Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini is the principal British agent on the continent of Europe from about 1830 to 1850 or so. And he is a radical nationalist. But he gets paid, and this is documented, by the British Admiralty. He's paid by Admiral Stansfeld of the British Admiralty. So Engels is clearly a member of the Mazzini Young Germany organization. Marx is closely linked to Mazzini, and these people are all in the British orbit, on the British payroll, British agents of influence. What do you have? Marx in particular says, the industrial workers are going to rise up and crush the industrial bourgeoisie. Well, what good does that do you? Well, it basically says, hey, you workers of France, above all, hey, you workers of Germany, Italy, whatever it is, rise up and fight against your own local industrial capitalists. And this is in a world, the world is dominated by the British Empire, but Marx does not register this fact. The industrial bourgeoisie is still a positive force all through the 19th century where it exists, but Marx wants you to fight them. He gives the British aristocracy and the British Empire a free ride. And the few times that he talks about the American system, he talks about Henry Carey and Friedrich List, and he condemns them. He says, those guys are class collaborationists. They're not as radical as I am. And then he writes about Gian Maria Ortes, and he says, a true genius. A true genius. So this is Marx. He tells you in this book called The Holy Family, quite early in his career, 1844, he tells you that he considers himself a continuation of the French materialists and the British empiricists and British materialists. And he says, Bacon and Hobbes, those were a good thing. That was a great pair, Bacon and Hobbes, because the goal of Hobbes was to furnish a proof of Bacon's fundamental principle that the origin of all human knowledge and ideas came from the world of sensation. Is this beginning to get familiar now? You're seeing the MO repeated again and again. Always pure empiricism, pure sensationalism. So again, the noble savage. And then Howard Zinn. We've been through it, right? For Howard Zinn, any civilization is bad, rebellions are good. And he's a part of the Gnome Chomsky clique, who provided the cover for the Pentagon Papers, which was a limited hangout psyop. And one of his heirs is that guy Kutznick, who has led Oliver Stone somewhat off the true path, let's say. In their, have you seen this? Their recent film, documentary series,
Untold History.
Untold History. Well, of course, it's a very difficult version. So what I say is, accept no Delphic substitutes. Not Marx. This is not the real thing. Now, the one thing that we can talk about that maybe comes out of Europe in the 19th century on some of these. You know the Gruber thesis? Gruber was this guy who had helped with Obamacare, and he gave some of these rather, I don't know what, boastful or foolish statements where he said, we made it really complicated so nobody could understand it because voters are stupid. Are voters stupid? Well, I'm afraid there is a problem here. You can call it false consciousness. People do not act according to their own interests. They are deluded. They are manipulated. They are led astray, right? Human folly is always there. Alienation. We had this discussion about money during one of the breaks. If you have money, some people will say, I can't start an economy without money. What they really mean to say is labor and plant and equipment. In other words, I need trained workers and I need plant with capital goods, with machine tools in it. But they can't express it this way because they've taken the productive power of humanity and they've posited this in gold or green pieces of paper or pieces of paper of some other color. So the alienation is you're no longer aware of human productivity as it really exists. You think that it's an attribute of stones or shiny paper. This is closely related to the fetishism of money, the fetishism of gold. You attribute magical properties to the stones and the shiny paper. Reification is another one. You make something into a thing. And again, if it's the productive power of humanity, they make it into stones and shiny paper. You notice this is all the basis of libertarianism once again. So the poor libertarians are the most alienated, the most fetishizing people, and the most victims of false consciousness, right? That they say, Wall Street is my friend and the government is my enemy. Well, go for the matador, not for the Cape. The matador is Wall Street, the government, the Cape. And of course, people are also guilty of racism and chauvinism, right? National chauvinism. They're guilty of parochialism. This is one of the worst things, is that people, they have regional rivalries. They have the feeling that, for example, if you're a trade unionist, you're a rival of some other union, you're a rival of the unemployed workers outside the door, of the ethnic minorities, of the immigrants, and all this other stuff, rather than seeing some political approach to class-wide unity. And part of this is the media, but part of it is also the institutions and how they work in this society, that they're not counterbalanced by a strong political party, let's say, that could fight for these common interests. Now, we're getting to economics. The first problem that we want to deal with is there a mathematical economics that can tell the entire story? Is what you see is that I'm arguing, forms of planning, forms of intervention that say, let's build infrastructure, let's build the maglev, let's build the electricity grid, let's rebuild the water systems, let's rebuild the locks, the canals, the ports, and all this other stuff. And you say, well, that, where are the equations, right? Where's the mathematical formalism that will tell us this would work? Well, of course, it will work. But here, what I want to get to now is why formal mathematical economics cannot exist and cannot work. And you see what I mean. How many have heard of Gödel's proof? Okay, good. A couple. So here's a mathematician, born in Germany, went to the Institute for Advanced Study. And around 1930, 1931, he comes up with a mathematical discussion, it's a paper, where he tells you two things. Let me just back up a second. If you want to have a mathematical economics, what you're really saying is that I can reduce the entire world to some axioms and then a series of theorems, and I can derive the entire world economy. I can show it on a flow chart coming from those axioms and those theorems. So I'll essentially have everything covered. I'll have it all on one flow chart, one spreadsheet, I guess we'd say today. Well, along comes Gödel, and he says, any formal mathematical system cannot be complete and consistent or free from contradictions at the same time. Yes?
Doesn't that contradict the objectivity kind of world of view?
No, what this says, this is essentially, I'm trying to show you, it gets back to this principle of creativity, and that formal logical systems cannot describe the world. Why mathematical economics is impossible. So if it's he's actually starting from the Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell. And he says, that's a theory of mathematics. Well, let's take that one, and if we prove it for that one, we proved it for all of them. A formal mathematics cannot be both complete and consistent at the same time. That's the first one. You can either choose. If you want to describe the entire world, you can't do it because it's going to be contradictory. You can describe part of the world. You can do the kind of stuff that I'm recommending, which is take an area of intervention and describe the effects of that. But you can't make the entire system into a mathematical system. Another way to say this is artificial intelligence in a computer will not happen, because the computer cannot be consistent and complete at the same time in the way that your mind can. It is an insuperable barrier to the formalization or mathematization of the world. You need the mathematics in key areas. Right? You want to go to the moon, you better have a lot of computer power. You want to do the genome, you got to have huge computer power. But what you cannot do is to describe the world. For example, you could imagine somebody would say, I'll make a computer model of the world and I'll predict what's going to happen. No. Because there's free will, and it can't be complete and also free from contradiction. So you can't be complete and consistent at the same time. Now the second one says a formal system that has built into it the denial of this. In other words, if you have a formal system that says, I am complete, this will always be contradictory. So in other words, this essentially means that within any formal system you give me, I can prove this proposition within that system. I can show the incompleteness within the system. I'll just show you what the obvious one is. You know the liar's paradox? Somewhere in this mathematical version of the world, of everything, all in one huge computer program, there's going to come up the moment where this system has to comment on itself. And it's going to say, this statement is true, that's okay. And another one is, this statement is false. And you think what that means. If there's a self-reflexive statement that says this statement is false, you go into an endless loop. Because look, it's telling you this statement is false. But if it's false, it means it's true. But if it's true, it can't be false. It never ends. It's an infinite loop. Yeah. This is the Achilles heel of every formal mathematical system. The moment where it says this statement is false. Because again, if it's false, then the content is false, meaning it's true. But if it's true, that contradicts the fact that it's false.
No, but it could just be, the statement can be used in two different ways. So in one way, you're saying the statement represents those four sentences, and then the statement also means something else. So, it's like, so that this statement is false. You could be referring to...
No, you can imagine, suppose this is all a series of windows that open up, right? So the window says the speed of light is, the weight of the earth is, the velocity of, and it's got the billions and trillions of facts in the world and everything else. And at a certain point, there's a moment where the system has to comment on itself. And where the system has to comment on itself, it has to entertain the possibility that the whole system is true, but it may also have to entertain the possibility that the system is false. And when you do that, you go into an infinite loop. Here it is again. This sentence is a lie, and it blows up in his face because it introduces you into an endless series, because it shunts you. Again, if the sentence is a lie, then it means that the system is true. But if it's true, it's not a lie. And if it's true, a lie, and it never ends. And that's this is the Gödel's proof T-shirt that I found online. That's the liar's paradox. It's a paradox because there's no way out of it. Then I'll express it in some other terms. There's no mathematical economics, no artificial intelligence by computers. Let's see. Formal systems break down when they're required to be self-reflexive, when they have to comment on themselves and, above all, give an account of their own origin. Formal system, where do you come from? Who made you? That's where it breaks down. And in reality, we know who made it. Somebody's creative thinking made it. But the system cannot penetrate into that black box that we talked about. So you're left with a formal system that cannot be self-reflexive. And this is the problem. Reason can and must be self-conscious. That's the best kind. Self-conscious reason is what you want. A formal logical system, understood as a so-called lattice of theorems, right? A whole series of statements, a catalog, as Aristotle would write it, right? A series of statements that includes everything about everything in the world, trying to be complete, will have to refer one possibility that the catalog is completely true and another possibility that the catalog has false statements in it. And once you admit that there's a possibility of false statements, the entire system blows itself up. They break down when they're required to be self-reflexive, and they break down when they're, another way to put it is, when they're required to account for their own origins, they break down. And that's Gödel's proof. And even if you build in the idea saying, no, I am complete, that will also be overthrown. So I would think you'd consider this to be a liberating moment. It was if you were tyrannized by arithmetic or by, all of these other things. This is a moment where you say, that cannot be the whole story of any phenomenon. Nothing is susceptible in a larger sense, right? In other words, the process of the universe is not susceptible to being reduced to a formal logical system. And human economics is not susceptible to that. You've got to have qualitative, deliberate interventions to reestablish equilibrium. You can't just say, the economy is a clock and I'm just going to let it run. It won't work. So you wish to defend the integrity of the formal logical systems against Gödel's proof. Is that accurate?
I'm not really familiar
Okay.
with the proof.
Yes.
Was Bertrand Russell's conclusion from the Principia that it was the class member paradox, right? Like a class can't be a member of itself, and then he concluded that that's just a structural property of.
But that it gets you close to this self-reflexive, in other words, where it begins to become a loop.
So he purported to found the inviolability of arithmetic on that basis, and therefore it's a property of the universe. I don't know.
What Gödel actually says is, if you have a formal system, there will always be true propositions that cannot be proven within that system. So in other words, it won't be complete. And if you try to make allowance for that, it will become contradictory. So there will always be true propositions which cannot be proven in the framework of the formal logical system. So it will never tell you the whole story. It will never be complete. And if you try to make it complete in the second proposition, you will fail, and you'll make it contradictory. The formal logical system cannot capture the complete essence or the complete story on something like a world economy. Can't be done.
It's the penchant for current high-level economics PhDs of like linear analysis, and that's essentially they can't look at the kind of sabotage political aspects. So they purport to have some completion, but they would just claim it's just a model.
What we would want to, what we're trying to do here is to advance the broadest possible statement of why that's misguided, right? Why that cannot be. And yes, there will be corruption, but even if we allow them to exist in the pure state, which he does, it still won't work. You can't have mathematical economics in that sense.
But, I mean, you're not suggesting to not use math.
No, just don't think that it's going to be complete and non-contradictory when you try to describe some macro phenomenon.
I mean, but so why 1% then? Why 1%?
Because we can say qualitatively that it will work. Because reason shows us that this is an approximate. And these are all approximations. You could say you want 5%. You could make a very good case. In any state, you'll find people who say, I want them to pay what I pay. If I pay 7, Maryland, I think, right? They'll say they should pay that. In California, it's 12. And you'll go there and they'll say, they should pay 12. If I pay 12, they pay 12. Now, that's probably too much. So we have to come up with a qualitative judgment, which is also political, right? It's a matter of proportion, what the traffic will bear, balance the needs against the ideology, the political forces in play, reactionaries, mushheads, all this other stuff. So you come up with something to say, I think this will work. But that's an art. That's not formal logical. It's an art. Economics has strong elements of art. You take a country in any given state, there's no mathematical way you can prove what is needed. You have to have a national economic plan, which is a series of great projects, right? We went through some of them, right? The West Coast Maglev, the East Coast Maglev, the Transcontinental Maglev, Mississippi Valley, Great Northern, and across the South. And try to hit as many states as you can for political reasons. So that's economic planning. And you can you got to use math to calculate, what's my population, how many have advanced degrees, where are they going, what's their health, what's their longevity, how many square meters of apartment space, and so forth, right? Or the actuarial questions of Social Security and Obamacare. Absolutely. That's all math, all arithmetic. It's all mathematics, but not the overarching big decisions of what should your policy be? And again, the notion that there's going to be artificial intelligence, it seems to me, and I'm certainly not a mathematician, but it seems to me that the idea of searching for computer-generated artificial intelligence in that something that could rival the human mind, this is misguided. It won't work. It's a waste. Because of this. How could a computer have a will? And how could it include the things that we can subsume? Not that we can include everything. That's not even our goal. But the formal systems break down. Here, a couple of other examples of this. It does go back to Plato and the dialogue called the Parmenides. And my story with this is I was in Germany one day, had to go to Italy overnight on the train, give a class on Plato's Parmenides. So it's not that long. I tried reading it in the train. Big mistake. Terrible mistake. The Parmenides is about the question, is the world composed of a continuous process that includes everything, or are there individual particles, units, and so forth, right? So we have the one, the whole, and the parts. And this is just a sample from the Parmenides. If there is the one cannot be made up of parts and cannot be a single part, because a part must be a part of the whole in order to differentiate from the many. I won't go on with this too long. If there's no beginning, no center, or an end, it can't be spherical or linear. The one cannot be touched because it has no parts, neither anywhere nor into itself, because that would be too many. And again, it goes on and on. So what he's trying to show you, and I got to Italy, I don't understand any of this, right? Because it's a reductio ad absurdum. If you say everything in the world is part of one continuous process, can be shown that this is wrong. If you say everything in the world is made up of atoms or components or something else, you can also show that that's wrong. And that's what he comes up with. The impossibility of a complete formal logical explanation of the world. In other words, something very much like Gödel's proof. That's the Parmenides.
Is that also Phaedo?
Huh?
Is that also on Phaedo?
I don't know. This is the one that I associate with that. Or Kant, even Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he says, here are the transcendental ideas. One is the universe has a beginning and limits, or the universe is infinite in both time and space. Well, as he shows you on the same page, you can prove that the universe has to have a beginning and that it has to have spatial limits. Or, on the same page, you can also prove that the universe is infinite in both time and space. So you can prove one and the opposite. Everything is composed of elementary particles. This is now the Parmenides. Everything is composed of elementary particles, or there are no elementary particles. And he proves both. Right? You said, for example, this. If the universe has a beginning, what was there before the beginning? In other words, you say there's the Big Bang. What is there before the Big Bang? Something. The pre-Big Bang. So you can just do this. It's so simple, right? You can prove both sides, or you can actually disprove both sides, I guess. Everything's elementary particles, or there are none. Discreteness versus continuity, and he proves both. How about freedom against necessity? Do you have free will, or are you subject to some kind of determinacy or predestination or something? And guess what here? He proves both. Both can be proven, or each one can be disproven. How about this? God, right? The world requires a necessary being, or the world requires no necessary being. God exists, God does not exist. Proves both. And what this somehow is that these are formal questions that go beyond what a formal system can do. You can't take a formal proposition and try to deal with these questions of this complexity. So from Gödel to Parmenides to Kant's conflicts of the transcendental ideas, what it shows is that formalistic logical thinking does not work. What works? Reason. So this is the whole thing we were doing in the afternoon, right? Not one, not two, but three. The level of reason. So the challenge to everybody, to all of us, every day, advance to the level of reason. Function on the level of reason. Understanding, mathematical, formal, logical things are fine. You need them. But when it comes to the big stuff, go to the level of reason. Try to go to the level of reason as much as you can. The readers of the Critique of Pure Reason are a very small club. I'm a member. Anybody in that club? Well, it's not. This is not a priority. Just interesting to know. Okay.
And so the jump from logic to reason is essentially getting like the bigger picture.
Reason creates the logical systems. The logical systems are made to present the results of reason. But that's the discoveries are not made at the level of logic. They should be presented at the level of logic. They should be argued for and depicted, right, with mathematical formalism. That's all great. You want to use the mathematical and other formalism to present the discovery. But that's not where the discovery comes from. The discovery comes from the higher faculty, reason, which is not bound by formal logical considerations. It has to be submitted to them for verification and checking, but it does not come about through them. And that's why, again, the formal logical system, when you ask it, where do you come from? Who made you? Are you true or false? It cannot answer. It's the self-reflexive moment. Reason can be self-conscious, but a formal logical system can't, because the formal logical system cannot comprehend the faculty of reason which generated it. It's the supremacy of reason is what we're trying to argue. Build your house on reason. Don't try to build it on formal, logical, mathematical. Advance beyond the level of understanding, in Plato's sense, to the level of reason.